Hello, I'm Jan Szrewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. As always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now in this episode, we're focusing on a monumental event happening right now, the NATO Summit in Washington, D.C. That's right, from Tuesday to Thursday. Leaders from around the world are gathering to celebrate NATO's 75th anniversary. But this isn't just any anniversary party, it's taking place at what might be the most perilous time for the alliance since the end of the Cold War. Picture a wedding anniversary with a family feud, economic woes and a couple of uninvited guests who keep crashing the party. Yeah, it is that tense. So without further ado, let's take a look at our report to find out more.
The three-day NATO Summit, beginning July 9th in Washington, D.C., will see 32 leaders of member states convene to discuss critical issues, with Ukraine high on the agenda. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has indicated that the summit will likely agree on a significant aid package for Ukraine, underscoring the alliance's continuing support amid the ongoing conflict.
We will also work together to build Ukraine's defense industry and deepen our cooperation on innovation. All the work we are doing together is making Ukraine stronger, more interoperable and better prepared than ever to join our alliance.
During his visit to Poland, President Zelensky also expressed his expectations regarding the summit.
First of all, I expect very concrete answers and steps from our partners at the NATO Summit. We'll have a meeting dedicated to reinforcing Ukraine's air defences, to our civilian infrastructure, water supply and the energy grid. I expect concrete steps.
A potential meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and US President Joe Biden is also on the cards, as the White House prepares for high-level discussions on the sidelines of the summit.
And now we're zooming in on Washington, D.C. to examine the issue in greater detail. The summit, themed around unity and strength, couldn't come at a more crucial time. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who is about to pass the baton to Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, has made it clear. We will demonstrate NATO's unity and strength to support Ukraine and ensure the security of all our citizens and values. Now, those words set the tone for what promises to be a pivotal few days. So what's on the agenda here? There are three main themes that will dominate the discussions. First, strengthening allied defense and deterrence. This has been NATO's top priority for the past decade, especially given Russia's increasingly aggressive stance. Remember, it was just last year at the Madrid summit that NATO unveiled its new strategic concept, and now they are focused on putting those plans into action. Now, this includes more money for defense, more troops on high readiness, and stronger defenses against hybrid threats such as cyber attacks, for example. Number two, of course, is supporting Ukraine's defense efforts. Ukraine is the star of the show. Stoltenberg recently met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and reaffirmed that Ukraine will be the top priority at the summit. However, despite high hopes, Ukraine won't be getting a formal invitation to join NATO just yet. Instead, NATO will focus on providing more military aid and making stronger commitments about Ukraine's future in the alliance. Finally, strengthening global partnerships, as NATO isn't just looking inward. They're also focusing on partnerships beyond the traditional Euro-Atlantic area. Leaders from Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea are joining the summit to discuss deeper cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Now, this marks a significant shift as NATO acknowledges the growing influence and challenge posed by China. Expect discussions on shared strategies to counteract Russian and Chinese activities. But let's not forget the internal dynamics at play. This summit is taking place against the backdrop of a significant political uncertainty. US President Joe Biden, who will be hosting, sees this as an opportunity to bolster his international standing and show leadership on the global stage. But with the US political landscape as volatile as ever, there is a looming question. What happens if Joe Biden doesn't stay in office? Former President Donald Trump, who has a drastically different approach to NATO, could very well be making a comeback. This adds an extra layer of tension, as allies wonder about the future direction of US foreign policy. The stakes couldn't be higher. Russia's actions in Ukraine have not only reignited fears of a broader conflict in Europe, but also emphasized the importance of a united and strong NATO. Leaders will need to balance immediate defense needs with long-term strategic goals, ensuring that the alliance is ready to face both conventional and hybrid threats. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Sergiej Sumlenny, Director at the European Resilience Initiative Center. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, and thank you for having invited me today.
So in the light of the NATO summit, do you think that NATO at this stage is able to maintain and continue its role as a provider of deterrence against Russia? This seems to have worked for decades. During the Cold War, after all, we haven't seen any nukes zipping around. But is it still the case with Russia being more and more aggressive, at least rhetorically, basically making it a part of its daily routine to threaten the use of nuclear weapons? Is this an indication that somehow our deterrence is less effective? Or is it simply about Russia preferring this sort of bluster to any sort of actual communication with NATO on serious issues?
Well, the deterrence is a tricky thing. You cannot say that it is like one-dimensional. You always have several components in deterrence. It is your practical technical capacity to fight your enemy. Do you have enough troops? Do you have enough ammunition? Do you have enough tanks, jets, navy, etc.? It is about, do you have plans? Do your politicians and your societies and your army know what to do in a case of a threat? For example, the German brigade stationed in the Baltic countries, do they have the rules of combat? What does the commander of brigade do if suddenly Russian shells strike the territory of this brigade? Does he or she need to call Berlin and ask for permission to fight back? Or is it automatically prescribed? What is the response? So the plans. And third, the political will to fight and the credibility of this deterrence. And this last aspect is the most missing aspect in the NATO. We always brag that how strong we are, how large are our economies, how marvelous are our arms. And that's true, like the Western arms have demonstrated their full superiority against the Russian arms. But do you have guts to use these arms against the enemy? And that is the part where Russia believes we do not have guts. And that's why they believe that with smaller means, with aggressive pressure, with aggressive rhetorics, they can beat us and force us practically to surrender before the real fight begins.
So essentially, they are expecting to be able to beat us into submission without even firing major shots, with perhaps some sort of local conflict, a local outbreak. Now, you've mentioned a couple of things here. First, the question of military capabilities. The second, the issue of political will. Now, before we move on to the question of politics and leadership, conventional weapons on the European continent. A lot has been said about how the European countries, especially those in the West, rely on the support and on the military equipment and presence of the United States. Now, recently a report has been published suggesting that we might be severely lacking in capabilities in order to repel a full-scale Russian invasion. So what do you think is the most urgent thing that needs to be done on this front in terms of conventional presence basically within the territories of all NATO countries, especially those exposed to any sort of Russian aggression potentially?
You're absolutely right. The whole concept of defense of Europe in a full-scale war was developed mostly in the 60s, 70s. And the idea was when the Soviets strike, then the European armies, Bundeswehr, and Bundeswehr was like 3 times bigger than now and much better equipped, with much more money went into the Bundeswehr compared to nowadays, that the European army will hold like for 2 weeks, and these 2 weeks are enough for the United States to bring their equipment and their armies across the Atlantic Ocean. And that's why the US stockpiled all the tanks and IFVs and planes in their deserts, like to be able to send them to Europe. I don't understand why they don't send this equipment now, because this is the war which this equipment was built for. But anyway, that was the concept. Now the question is, are the United States ready to fight several wars? They have their attention focused on China, and Taiwanese tensions are important for the United States, much more than Russia-Ukrainian war, unfortunately. And what will happen when China attacks Taiwan, or when North Korea launches a sneak attack on South Korea? What will happen if China starts like several conflicts in Africa or in South America, the countries, the regions where China owns practically many countries? So from the US perspective, and the US, unfortunately, independently of is it Biden in the office or Trump in the office, both administrations are pretty much isolationistic. And they say, okay, Ukraine is your European war. If you don't care about this war, why should we care? Like, we contain Russia, but we will not intervene. So that is the problem, that the United States is not ready to be involved in a European war, this or potential, as it was involved and as it was committed in the 1970s. Or like in 1960s, when American brigade was stationed in West Berlin and was ready to die in a case when the Soviets would try to take West Berlin, the city which was not to be protected. It was unprotectable city. You cannot defend it. But it was a statement. If you want to take West Berlin, you need to kill the United States soldiers. And you will not dare to do it because the retaliation will be devastating. Now there is no such commitment.
Well, this brings us to the question of deterrence, right? Doesn't the current administration or the potential Trump administration, as you said, there is a degree of commonality there in terms of this approach. Don't they understand the fact that if Ukraine is allowed to fall or is allowed to basically to languish under this sort of condition of constant attritional warfare, isn't this sending exactly the signal they would like to avoid to any potential aggressors elsewhere across the world? That, look, we were not able to secure our interests here on the European continent. And so China might be looking at this and thinking, okay, so if they were not able to defend Ukraine, they will not be able to defend Taiwan. I mean, this is a very difficult theater, isn't it? Different, hardly easier for the United States to actually control and contain. So doesn't this point towards the fact that, in this case at least, deterrence would require this very sort of commitment that the US authorities are not willing to make, a commitment towards letting Ukraine win?
Well, the paradox of this Russo-Ukrainian war is that, on one hand, Ukraine is demonstrating amazing success. The level of destruction of Russian and practically Soviet-designed tanks, IFVs, other equipment is extraordinary. The Black Sea is practically interdicted for the Russian Navy. The Russian Navy has fled to far harbors in the east of the Black Sea because the Ukrainians, country without any navy, have destroyed like a large amount of the Black Sea fleet and practically pushed them outside of the Black Sea. That is actually a very good sign for Taiwan, because if the attack will happen, it would happen across the Strait of Taiwan. And the Ukrainian troops have demonstrated how to deal with larger landing vessels or other larger vessels in such like contained waters. But on the other hand, the war against Ukraine led by Russia has also demonstrated that a dictatorship, if it's reckless enough and if it violates the basics of the international law, actually get rewarded. And the United Nations are ready to communicate with them, to offer them some sort of a deal and to listen to them, and is not ready
to allow them to chair the UN Security Council of all things. And this is not the first time it happens during this war.
Absolutely. And look at other international institutions. Look at the International Olympic Committee, which is not an international institution, like an organization, but still like on all levels, like culture, sport, politics, Russian Rosatom is still welcomed everywhere in the world, despite the fact that Rosatom operates a hijacked Ukrainian nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia and is a part of Russia's nuclear blackmailing of the world. So this demonstrates to the dictators in the whole world that if you're reckless enough, and especially if you have a nuclear device, the world can forgive you a lot of things. And that sends a very bad signal. So on one hand, as I said, good hope for many people saying that even huge armies like the Russian army, because Russians have thrown everything into this war. They have produced since World War II all the tanks. Decades of production, of Soviet tanks production, were thrown into this war, and most of these tanks have been destroyed. So dictators are pretty weak. They cannot win these wars, but they can cause you, a democracy, so much harm, and the world will look so reluctant at your fight, at your suffering, that maybe if you're not strong enough as Ukraine, if you're not willing enough to fight as Ukrainians do, maybe you will still be beaten into submission.
Which brings me to my next question concerning leadership. Have we forgotten how to win wars?
Absolutely. And that is the problem, that the generation of the politicians now, it's a good thing because they are children of peace, and we are all children of peace. We have not experienced any major war in our life. But it means that the politicians cannot fight cannot fight a war where they face an evil, where they face a power which is not interested in any sort of compromise, which are interested in destruction and death. If we look at how, for example, Olaf Scholz or Joe Biden act in this situation, they always try to find a middle ground. They always find not to cross a red line. Can we imagine Winston Churchill saying, oh, please, don't bomb refineries of the Third Reich? That would be a red line for Adolf Hitler, and that can lead to devastating things. No, if we had, instead of Roosevelt and Churchill, if we had Biden and Scholz back then, Auschwitz would have still been functional in Europe.
But then again, they sat down with Stalin and they divided Europe. So that is another thing, obviously. But without resorting to historical analogies too much, I think it's safe to say that the ongoing NATO Summit is a very important forum for exchanging these ideas, perhaps, as you're suggesting, bolder ideas for deterrence, as the war in Ukraine right now remains the most important security challenge with implications all across the globe. And NATO clearly should do more to make dictators feel less at home, make them feel like they should be really worried about our response and not that they will get away with everything that they do. Sergei Sumlenny was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you so much.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, bringing you all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi went to Moscow for his first visit to Russia since the country launched its military campaign in Ukraine. The visit comes as Modi balances maintaining a long-standing relationship with Moscow, while also seeking closer Western security ties.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin shared an informal meeting at Putin's residence in Novogoryovo, just outside Moscow. They enjoyed tea on a terrace, rode in a golf cart together and visited stables. Modi expressed delight with the visit and thanked Putin for the evening chat. Despite Russia's actions in Ukraine, India has refrained from explicit condemnation and abstained from United Nations resolutions censuring Moscow. However, the conflict has had a human cost for India, with citizens reportedly killed after being forced to fight in Ukraine. Moscow remains a key supplier of cut-price oil and weapons to India, but the Kremlin's isolation from the West and blooming friendship with Beijing have impacted its partnership with New Delhi.
Ukraine has appealed to Poland to consider using its air defenses to safeguard Ukrainian airspace near the Polish border. The request was made during a meeting in Vilnius involving parliamentary representatives from Ukraine, Poland and Lithuania.
Olena Kondratiuk, the deputy speaker of Ukraine's Supreme Council, emphasized the urgency of the situation and urged her Polish counterpart Małgorzata Kidawa-Błońska to consider deploying Polish air defenses to protect the Ukrainian border regions. During a meeting with President Zelensky in Warsaw, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said Poland was indeed contemplating a scenario where Polish air defenses would shoot down incoming Russian missiles close to the border. The Prime Minister noted, however, that such a development would first require consensus among NATO partners. The situation was brought into sharp focus on July 8th, when Russian forces launched an air attack on Ukraine, which killed scores of civilians. The Ukrainian military warned of potential cruise missile launches from Russian bombers expected to enter Ukrainian airspace after 2 a.m. In response, Poland scrambled its aircraft to patrol Polish airspace.
Authorities in Russia's North Caucasus Republic of Dagestan are limiting access to WhatsApp, citing the platform's refusal to curb the spread of calls to participate in extremist actions. This comes weeks after a terrorist attack on churches and synagogues in the region.
Residents of Dagestan have begun experiencing disruptions with WhatsApp and cannot access it without a VPN. But as it turns out, VPNs in Dagestan only work in 10-minute increments, requiring users to restart them to regain access to the app. Dagestan authorities supposedly made demands to the app's owners to hold the spread of calls deemed extremists, but they were ignored. This crackdown comes after coordinated attacks on 2 churches, 2 synagogues and a police checkpoint in a Muslim-majority region last month, which resulted in more than 20 deaths. The region has since been on a high alert. Russia banned Meta, the owner of WhatsApp, shortly after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. While Facebook and Instagram were included in the ban, WhatsApp was exempted from these restrictions.
In the face of deteriorating socio-economic conditions, Turkmenistan's authorities have resorted to creating troll farms to bolster their public image. These state-sponsored troll factories disseminate false information through the voices of seemingly ordinary citizens.
Turkmenistan's economic woes have escalated, with inflation soaring and basic necessities growing scarce. In response, the government has intensified its grip on information, stifling dissent and suppressing any criticism. The troll farms operate round the clock, deploying an army of online personas to flood comment sections, forums and social media threads, with messages praising the government's policies and emphasizing stability and prosperity. Their narratives usually highlight the country's supposed achievements, such as infrastructure development and cultural preservation. Meanwhile, any dissenting voices are met with criticism, personal attacks and even threats. Critics argue that these troll farms are a desperate attempt to salvage the regime's reputation as the country grapples with economic issues. The government's control over media and internet access has left citizens with limited ways to express their grievances. Independent journalism is virtually non-existent, and dissenters risk imprisonment.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.